Introduction to Menggongfang Coffee Shop. www.zhaosuiyuan.com Menggongfang Coffee Shop is located near Qingshan Road and Hangshan Road in Pudong New Area. It belongs to the owner Yu Qinghong, and more importantly, to all the employees working here. When it opened on June 28, 2019, the fun-filled daily stories that occurred among the employees in this coffee shop were sometimes funny, sometimes bizarre, sometimes romantic, and sometimes https://www.zhaosuiyuan.com. Chapter 1. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. 1. There is a person with short hair, smooth skin, and a black mole on the right side of her mouth. She is the principal of Dream Workshop and Auxiliary School, named Wang Ying. I have just turned 50 years old. Wang Ying is a series of video programs launched under the name of Principled Wisdom Education. It adopts the form of keynote speeches, with one person, one viewpoint, one school, one product, and one characteristic, showcasing the educational wisdom, governance practices, and educational sentiments of the school principals and secretaries. Adhering to the educational philosophy of running Rongha schools and providing the most appropriate education for every intellectually disabled child, so that every child can achieve better development, we have put forward the educational goal of Rongha, which maximizes the satisfaction of social needs and the educational needs of special children. We aim to enable every intellectually disabled student to integrate into society, live a harmonious life, develop their potential, increase knowledge, acquire skills, improve their personality, and enhance their social adaptability, becoming a useful talent for society and promoting their life growth. Wang Ying sat in a wheelchair, and for some reason, her legs could never move. She was so miserable that she could only rely on the wheelchair to make a living, like a person with a physical disability. At this moment, a middle-aged man with more wrinkles on his face, approaching the age of 40.5, walked over. He is Wu Degue, the teaching secretary of the school, one level below the principal. Wu Degue smiled and said, "Principal, how have you been lately?" Wang Ying nodded and said, "It's okay. It took me a lot of effort to take care of disabled students." Wu Degue said, "Speaking of which, you don't seem too happy." Wang Ying exclaimed, "Do you have it? How can you tell?" Wu Degue chuckled and said, "Because you are very worried." Wang Ying nodded and said, "If you see this, it would be a pity not to become a detective." Wu Degue chuckled and said, "If you want me to be like Sherlock Holmes, that's not possible. Because I won't have to look at the body like a police officer." Wang Ying nodded and said, "By the way, how about the arrangement of health education now?" Wu Degue nodded and said, "Don't worry. Once it's arranged, the children don't have to worry about lunch." He added, "We already have a lunch post." Wang Ying said, "Most students can't read or understand. Let parents take a look later." Wu Degue nodded and said, "Okay. I understand." He said, "Do we have a meeting later?" Wang Ying nodded and said, "That's right, should we go to the conference room for a meeting in half an hour?" Wu Degue nodded and said, "Okay then." He walked out of the office. Wang Ying sat in a wheelchair and pushed the wheel to the window to look outside. The school playground has a very wide area, which is half the size of a football field. 4 sides are drawn with quicklime on the ground. In the middle of the playground is a circle, with a long vertical line running from top to bottom. The bottom 3 lines of the playground form a shape, with a semi-dot circular symbol above it. Behind the shape is a tall, white, and sturdy goal, and the grid behind shakes a few times with the cold wind. A sparrow on the goal shook its wings twice before flapping its wings and flying away with the wind. Wang Ying touched her legs and frowned, "Why is it so painful? Really, why is it still so painful? This is an indelible pain." Wang Ying closed her eyes and slowly opened them again, feeling particularly green. Chapter 2. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. There is a cafe called Dream Workshop at 345 Qingshan Road. Yu Qinghong came to the city from her hometown 29 years ago. At that time, she was just a young and beautiful girl, which intoxicated the soul. Yu Qinghong planned to rent a shop in Pudong to make a living, and at that time she had very abundant funds. Coincidentally, she happened to be transferring the Shangnan campus of her auxiliary school at 345, Qingshan Road on the storefront. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Sister Yu quickly discussed with the principal of the auxiliary school, Wang Ying, to invest and contract it, becoming the owner of the Yuelong small restaurant. After a few years, her business gradually became prosperous, and every guest said that the restaurant opened by Sister Yu had good service and delicious food, which made Yu Qinghong unanimously recognized by the guests. Of course, the principal of the auxiliary school is requested to collaborate with Yu Qinghong to create a social-oriented plan that provides employment opportunities for individuals with special mental disabilities. Sister Yu is very honored to become the owner and counselor of Dream Workshop Coffee Bar. Little did Sister Yu expect that a word in her heart would come true, which is unbelievable. Sister Yu is very happy to finally work with mentally disabled children as a foundation for social and future development. Yu Qinghong was in the coffee shop, drinking coffee while yawning. She looked at the beautiful woman at the cashier and said, "That Xinli. How much money is this quarter?" Zhu Xinli is the eldest daughter of Yu Qinghong, a beautiful woman with glasses. She hummed and said, "If we calculate it quarterly, it will cost several thousand yuan." Yu Qinghong exclaimed, "It's only a few thousand yuan, those are even less than what I spend on coffee beans." Zhu Xinli walked up to her mother and patted her shoulder, saying, "Mom, you look so skinny, you're really being too frugal." Yu Qinghong shook her head and said, "There's nothing we can do. Do you know how much it will cost to open a store? Do you need electricity? Do you need coffee? There are other expenses, and we can only maintain our figure to make a living." Zhu Xinli shook her head and looked across the street, saying, "Compared to the CAFA across the street, it seems that their business is as good as ours, which is outrageous." Yu Qinghong waved her hand and said, "What's going on here? What kind of coffee beans are used in their coffee, imported from foreign countries? They're all smooth, and what kind of delicious ones are worth it? All of this is nonsense." Zhu Xinli shook her head and said, "It's just bragging about herself, wanting to make herself bigger or something. It's not a big deal, right?" Yu Qinghong let out a sigh and said, "Girl, how did you handle the salaries of those disabled children?" Zhu Xinli waved her hand and said, "Of course there's no problem. I'm at least a finance graduate, and I've already completed these tasks." Yu Qinghong let out a sigh and said, "It's good to have you." At this moment, a little boy with eyes and a straight head came bouncing over and said to Yu Qinghong, "Sister Yu, do you want me to bring coffee?" This bouncing little boy named Yang Haoyu is a mentally challenged boy who suffers from motor disorders and is unconscious. Even without coffee, he can still say these words. Yu Qinghong touched his head and smiled slightly, saying, "Of course there's no problem, but there's no coffee now." Yang Haoyu chuckled foolishly and said, "Do you want me to handle it?" Yu Qinghong thought to herself, "It seems that this child has developed a habit of cutting off coffee." He said, "All right. The guests will arrive soon. How about we serve coffee?" Yang Haoyu raised his hand and said, "All right. I want it too, I want it too." Yu Qinghong couldn't help but laugh and cry and said, "Now go to the door and stand well. If you stand well at the door, how about I give you candy if you behave well? If you don't stand well, the candy will be gone, you know." Yang Haoyu said nauseously, "Okay. You have to promise me to give me candy to eat." Zhu Xinli patted Niu Haoyu's shoulder and said, "Okay, okay. I'll give you candy right away, but you have to be good. All right, go and stand up." Yang Haoyu smiled foolishly and said, "Of course it's good, of course it's good." He immediately went there and stood up. Yu Qinghong exclaimed, "What sets it apart from other coffee shops is that the employees here are all disabled, right?" Zhu Xinli exclaimed, "Didn't you say before that disabled people could find jobs?" Yu Qinghong spread her hands and said, they are all children with intelligence of 3 or 2 or below, like those who can't write, are nonsensical, can't do household chores, and even spit everywhere in the store. There are many of these people. Zhu Xinli hummed and said, it's better than working outside. For example, coffee shops like Starbucks and Luckin Coffee require a university degree or above to work. Those of us who have no education and work unconsciously are all rejected. Yu Qinghong said, no wonder the school principal expects me to take in these students. Indeed, they have nowhere to go. Zhu Xinli nodded and said, it would be great if you could take them in. Chapter 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Wang Ying pushed a wheelchair and walked quietly onto the red runway, following the middle of the 2 white lines. To his left was a tightly sealed purple fence building made of several thin lines. The bottom of the building was winding, with a clear path paved with white pebbles. To the east of the path was a flower garden filled with colorful flowers, and there were also several poplar trees swaying in the wind. Next to the garden was a small river flowing with blue waves. Dozens of koi fish were playing in the water, and on both sides of the river were small purple square tiles. The middle area is a small flat board bridge made of ancient logs, with wooden fences made of X on both sides of the bridge. This bridge leads to the back door of the Dream Workshop Coffee Bar, which is the only bridge connecting the school and social work. Now, the back door of the Dream Workshop Coffee Bar is tightly closed and covered with thick invisible glass paper. Fortunately, it's not transparent glass paper, otherwise it would have been discovered. Wang Ying vigorously turned the wheelchair and slowly, vigorously walked towards the bridge. This seems a bit tiring, but she can actually ask someone to help her, but she doesn't need to push her onto the bridge as much. Wang Ying finally climbed onto the bridge, but turned hard and quickly descended under the wheelchair bridge, only to collide with a landing door. Fortunately, the glass of the door was very sturdy and there were no cracks, but the sound of the collision was a bit loud. Wang Yinggang breathed a sigh of relief as the landing door automatically opened. Wang Ying saw Yu Qinghong holding a remote control and standing behind the door. She exclaimed, "It's you, Principal." Wang Ying smiled and said, "I'm sorry to say hello to you in this way." She pointed to the glass door and said, "Your door is sturdy." Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "Yeah. I spent a lot of money to install a glass door that can't even be pierced by bullets." Wang Ying sneered, "If the truck rushes in, your glass may be scrapped." Yu Qinghong said, "Why did you hit the glass door? Are you okay?" Wang Ying chuckled and said, "Who asked me to force myself onto the bridge? I didn't grasp the force and collided on the spot, but fortunately your glass door is still quite sturdy." Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "Really? As long as you're okay, it's okay." She said, "Do you want a cup of coffee?" Wang Ying nodded and said, "Okay, let's have a drink." Yu Qinghong said, "How about the newly launched Bloody Mary Rose Coffee?" Bloody Mary's coffee, Wang Ying smiled and said, "Won't it be coffee with blood added?" Yu Qinghong covered her mouth and smiled, saying, "Of course it's not that scary. You can add red syrup, milk, and a few rose petals to make a bloody rose coffee." Wang Ying nodded and said, "That's good." She said, "How much is it?" Yu Qinghong said, "Originally it was 20.5 yuan, but it has just been produced and only costs 20 yuan. She looked at Wang Ying and said, "You don't need to pay." Wang Ying smiled and said, "If anything, even I have to pay." At this point, the most basic etiquette of citizens is that no matter what, I have to pay. Don't stop me. Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "That's good. I'll bring you closer to the most comfortable room, which would be better." Yu Qinghong pushed the wheelchair and brought Wang Ying closer to the window. Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "Is this okay?" Wang Ying looked out the window and said, "It's great, but I'll just sit in a wheelchair." Yu Qinghong said, "So I'll go make coffee." She walked into the kitchen. Chapter 4. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The Dream Workshop Hotel is also a private hotel opened by Yu Qinghong. Yu Qinghong's husband Zhu Xinxiang opened a hotel together in order to help with his investment career. There aren't many people eating today. A middle-aged man was eating Hangzhou cabbage when he found a strand of hair. He chuckled, "Waiter, where is the waiter?" A burly man walked over, named Zhu Xingang, who was the second son of Yu Qinghong and Zhu Xinli's younger brother. He exclaimed, "What's wrong, this guest?" The middle-aged man grabbed his hair with chopsticks and angrily said, "Look at what this is." Zhu Xingang looked at his hair and opened his mouth wide, saying, "Hair." He said, "I'm really sorry, I let you eat your hair." The middle-aged man pointed his chopsticks at Zhu Xinxiang and said, "This is the brand of your Dream Workshop Hotel. Don't you even know the basic knowledge of hygiene and cleanliness? Do you know how many bacteria are in this hair? That would cost me hundreds of yuan for medical expenses." Zhu Xinxiang bowed and said, "I'm really sorry. I'll cook a new dish for you as compensation." The middle-aged man snorted and said, "Do you think you already understand this matter? Let me tell you, you have caused a big trouble." Zhu Xinxiang shook his head and said, "It's not that exaggerated. You know it's not easy for us to do small business. It's really not easy." The middle-aged man angrily said, "What's that to me? I'm a white-collar worker in the company, and I'm not at the same level as you guys who don't have the money to try. You better figure this out." At this moment, a middle-aged man with a flat head walked over and said in a low voice, "What's so noisy about?" Zhu Xinxiang looked at him and said, "Father, you're here." This flat-haired father's name is Zhu Xingang, the founder of Dream Workshop. He looked at the customer and said, "What's going on?" "This customer, what's in our dish?" The middle-aged man looked at Zhu Xiang's forehead and said, "You're the boss. Look at what this is. Hair, you know how disgusting this thing is." Zhu Xingang smiled apologetically and said, "I'm sorry, it could have been my employee's mistake that led to this. How about I cook you a new dish without adding any extra money? Keep burning, you're making my ears go numb." The middle-aged man snorted, "You think burning another plate of vegetables can fool me? It's unethical of you to do things. You know this hair is the most disgusting thing, didn't you say something?" Zhu Xingang chuckled and said, "Big brother, for my sake, cook a new dish." He took out a cigarette and said, "Come on, calm down." The middle-aged man threw his cigarette on the ground and said, "I don't want it. You know, we high-end white-collar workers are not on par with you low-level people. If the bacteria in our hair affect my brain, how should I work? Can you tell me?" Zhu Xinxiang looked at his father and said, "Dad, this person seems too confident for me." Zhu Xingang chuckled and said, "So what do you think we should do?" The middle-aged man snorted and said, "It's simple. Hair is the most serious thing. You just need to compensate for mental damages, including a profit of 3,000 yuan. That's it." Zhu Xingang opened his mouth wide and said, 3,000 yuan. "Big brother, help me out. I'll just forget about this matter, for the sake of my face." "What's your face?" "You still have a reason," the middle-aged man snorted. "Since you're so stubborn, I can only complain about you." Chapter 5. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. 1. At this moment, Zhu Xingang smiled slightly and said, "It's really regrettable. We have cameras here, can you go and see what's going on?" The middle-aged man asked in confusion, "Camera, what does it mean?" At this moment, Zhu Xinli walked over and said, "What's going on?" Zhu Xinxiang exclaimed, "It's sister." He whispered, "It's like this. The guest said he ate some hair. He might want to mislead us." Zhu Xinli said, "Of course, you can watch the surveillance footage." She said to the middle-aged man, "Your position is right in front of the probe. You can take a look and see how it goes." The middle-aged man chuckled and picked up his hair. He hurriedly said, "No need, I'll leave right away." He immediately took his hair and left. Zhu Xinli chuckled and said, "I don't know the guy who wants to touch porcelain." So what? If 3,000 yuan were taken away by him like this, as the saying goes, the cooked duck would fly away. Zhu Xinang said, "I lost a small part of this expense." "That's just 3,000 yuan, Zhu Xinxiang chuckled and said, "just like the cleaners outside, it's better to save more money." Zhu Xinli said, "It's better to be careful. If there is a collision like just now, the money will be gone." Tu Wang Yaoi is a thief, but he is not a true thief. He never engages in drug trafficking, fraud, or murder, because these people can do anything for money. He was about to take someone's life, which made him very disgusted. Previously, Wang Yaoi studied karate in high school and then applied to Public Security University. However, due to my personal lack of etiquette and image, I did not pass the written test. Although I did not pass the written test, he felt that Public Security University had no interest in him at all. Later, Wang Thief transferred to normal university, but after a year of study, he was detained for stealing something from someone else and later expelled by the teacher. Due to the theft, he felt that he would face a fine or something. Now Wang Thief can only live a peaceful life in a dilapidated house. Now that I'm out of the house, I plan to take a walk as a sport. At this moment, a very beautiful girl walked towards me. She was Zhang Lili, Wang Thief's college classmate, but he only knew her for a year. Zhang Lili looked at Wang Thief in surprise and said, "Aren't you Wang Thief?" Wang Daoi's name has the word thief, which is an unlucky name that his deceased father called him. Perhaps this is also the reason why the word thief made me steal things. Wang Thief chuckled and said, "So it's Zhang Lili. How coincidentally I met you." He exclaimed, "No, it's been a long time." Zhang Lili covered her mouth and smiled, saying, "I teach Chinese courses at a nearby school." Because normal university not only shoulders the mission of cultivating high-level teachers, but also has been endowed with a brand new symbol of a comprehensive talent training base with the development of society. Wang Thief originally intended to become a teacher, but unfortunately, I made an inappropriate mistake and ended up as an unemployed wanderer. That's natural, because all the students in normal universities are teachers, Wang Thief said with a chuckle. Zhang Lili chuckled and said, "Because you were the darkest one touched by the school. Since you stole money from a classmate and were discovered by the teacher, when you were arrested by the police, I haven't seen you again, have I?" The thief chuckled and said, "I really lost my life." He chuckled and said, "Who made me obsessed with stealing money and ended up being locked up for a month?" Zhang Lili chuckled and said, "It seems you can't go to college anymore." She shook her head and said, "No, you can." "I don't want to study anymore," Wang Thief exclaimed. "Anyway, living as an unemployed wanderer is still quite good." Zhang Lili exclaimed, "Really? So how do we live our lives? Are we still stealing things?" Wang Thief waved his hand and said, "I'm not that foolish. I have to go in again to steal things. I don't have such a good appetite." He said, "Anyway, if I steal things openly again, it's not a matter of detention, but a sentence." Zhang Lili exclaimed, "How was your time in prison before?" When Wang Theft thought about the detention center, he was a bit jumpy and restless. He said, "This is terrible. It's unbearable to eat prison food, listen to the endless education courses of the police, and recite the topic of positive energy." Zhang Lili covered her mouth and smiled, saying, "Come on. You look unwilling." She said, "Is that right?" Wang Thief blushed a bit and rubbed his head, saying, "I'm a bit embarrassed when you say that." "There's no shame in that, right?" Zhang Lili said in a soft voice. Wang Qiangyi said, "Are you going to school now?" Zhang Lili took out her phone and exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, I forgot what I said. So I'll leave first and chat with you another day." She turned right from the intersection and left his sight. Wang Thief muttered to himself, "After all, I don't know why I suddenly fell in love with her, probably because of admiration. Chapter 6. You are listening at novelfull.audio. One Yu Qinghong cooked the Bloody Mary rose coffee just as the timer rang. She turned off the fire, spread a grass mat on the table, and put the coffee pot on top. Describing these motherly details is because the atmosphere at this moment is very tense, to the extent that even a trivial matter is like an enlarged performance, becoming particularly important. At that moment, perception becomes very sensitive. Coffee and water blend seamlessly. The air continued to blend in, and the coffee produced bubbles. Finally, it quieted down. Yu Qinghong took off the top layer of the coffee pot and placed it on the water control plate in the recess of the cover. Yu Qinghong poured 2 cups of coffee and added a little wine to his cup. She added some cream and 2 cubes of sugar to her own cup. She didn't even know how she opened the refrigerator and took out the creamer box. Yu Qinghong handed Wang Ying the Bloody Mary rose coffee, and she smiled and said, "Please have some coffee." Wang Ying said, "I have already paid you the money." Yu Qinghong sat opposite Wang Ying and said with a smile, "Actually, you don't have to bother paying so much." Wang Ying smiled and said, "It's okay. Paying is everyone's heart. If you don't pay, you will be greedy for small gains. This behavior is very bad." "Do you think so?" Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "You're right, right." Wang Ying smiled and said, "How has the store been this year?" Dream Shop Coffee Bar was opened on June 28, 2019 last year, and this year it is June 28, 2020, just 1 year ago. Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "It's been a year since we opened the store, and I feel like the children are starting to have unstable emotions. The baristas are always talking to themselves, and some classmates are jumping up and down in the store. Some are always giggling, and all kinds of emotions are playing out in front of me. As a manager, I'm like a little bee, completely at a loss. After calming them down, I always wonder if my education is not good, or if there are other reasons." After listening to it, Wang Ying said earnestly, "Xiao Xiao, don't worry. Although their emotions are a bit unstable, their strengths are indeed much stronger than ours. You need to educate them from the bottom of your heart, not doubt your own problems. As long as you have a heart of love for them, they will become good salespeople, right?" Yu Qinghong said, "That's true." She said, "It can't compare to well-known coffee shops like Starbucks or Luckin Coffee." Wang Ying smiled and said, "These well-known brands are good, but here's also good." She said, "If DreamWorks could be transformed into a well-known brand, it would still be second only to Starbucks or Luckin, but it seems unlikely to be like this." Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "The most important thing is money, which is also a fact." She said, "I'm worried that my classmates may not be suitable for jobs with brands like Starbucks or Luckin, and no one is talking to them. That's also the situation I'm worried about." Wang Ying smiled and said, "These children are very eager to chat, but they don't have many friends. Only when they are in a group can they feel confident, happy, and harmless. Why can't we approach them and make them confident, happy, and harmless, right?" Yu Qinghong nodded and said, "You're saying the same thing." Chapter 7. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Gong Yuanyuan is playing the computer in front of his desk at home. Gong Yuanyuan is as beautiful as a flower. She is a Hunan little girl who is Yu Qinghong's cousin. She graduated from university with literature and is also as beautiful as a flower. Many men are around her, and there are also men who want to date me, but she firmly refused his request. She used to work as a clerk in a certain company, but was dismissed due to physical discomfort. This time, she is going to Shanghai and plans to find another job. Gong Yuanyuan finished typing the last word, stood up, walked to the wash basin in the bathroom, turned on the faucet, washed her face, washed off the oil stains, and then turned off the faucet. Just as Gong Yuanyuan walked out of the restroom, the doorbell rang. Gong Yuanyuan walked over to the opposite door and saw a bright and energetic young man with protruding bones appearing in front of him. Gong Yuanyuan exclaimed, "Are you Zhu Xinxiang?" Zhu Xinxiang nodded and said, "That's right, I just wanted to take a stroll here and happened to come to your house." Gong Yuanyuan let out a sigh and said, "How do you know my current home?" Zhu Xinxiang chuckled and said, "You have my WeChat, which I saw on your social media." Gong Yuanyuan exclaimed, "Yes. I've forgotten all about it." Gong Yuanyuan asked Zhu Xinxiang to enter the room, where his home can be said to be very small, only the size of a one-bedroom household, with an area of only a few square meters. And outside, the sunshine is bright and the sky is as clear as a wash. Waves of sunlight shine on the window across from our house, and then reflect on our walls, making it feel golden and dazzling, making it difficult to open our eyes. "I think so," Zhu Xinxiang hummed, "my home is very small." Gong Yuanyuan nodded and said, "There's no way. The rent is expensive now, and I'm worried that I won't be able to afford it." She looked around and said, "But this house is a bit cheaper than other houses." Zhu Xinxiang sat down in a chair with his legs crossed and said, "Some houses are expensive because of the advanced level of science and land, so the rent is also outrageously expensive, right?" Gong Yuanyuan nodded and said, "Yes. I was originally interested in the old houses near Huangpu Square, but they are located in a prime location and naturally expensive. Compared to them, they are much cheaper here." Zhu Xinxiang nodded and said, "This is not a bustling area, I don't think it's a big deal, after all, it's just very cheap." Gong Yuanyuan touched his hair and said, "If the salary at Dream Workshop Cafe is not high, the money can only be used to pay rent, and the remaining money can only be used to buy things to make a living." Zhu Xinxiang nodded and said, "That's right, there's no other way." He said, "Do you want to work there?" Gong Yuanyuan exclaimed, "Yes, what do you think?" Zhu Xinxiang exclaimed, "Of course you can." He said, "It would be great if you could work there." Gong Yuanyuan nodded and said, "Okay. So when will we go?" Zhu Xinxiang exclaimed, "Whatever, if you go now, I won't object." Gong Yuanyuan exclaimed, "Okay, that's good." Zhu Xinxiang looked at Gong Yuanyuan and said, "I think you should keep looking at me." Gong Yuanyuan hesitated slightly and said, "I haven't been staring at you all the time." Zhu Xinxiang touched her face and said, "No, I think looking at me means you're interested in me." Gong Yuan exclaimed, "Is that really the case?" "I don't think so." Zhu Xian arched her mouth and said, "Do you mind playing kissing with me?" Gong Yuanyuan was surprised and said, "Playing kissing is just mouth to mouth." Zhu Xinxiang chuckled and said, "Then come quickly." Gong Yuanyuan touched his face and pushed him aside, saying, "Let's talk about this kind of thing later." Zhu Xinxiang lay on the ground and chuckled at Gong Yuanyuan, saying, "Indeed, it still doesn't work." Chapter 8. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On this picturesque sidewalk, there is a beautiful and dignified girl named Wu Jianni with brown hair, melon seed face, and one of her front teeth is very prominent. She used to have 2 front teeth. The reason was that 2 years ago, she was pushed from behind by a hooligan in Mount Huangshan, Anhui Province, which caused her to fall on the ground. One of her front teeth fell with blood. Later, her boyfriend who met for the first time protected her and punched the hooligan in the jaw. The hooligan ran away in a bad way. From then on, Wu Jianni only had 1 front tooth, but there were also benefits, as she didn't have to be ridiculed by people for having 2 front teeth. She was walking on the sidewalk when something suddenly slipped on her right heel, causing her body to suddenly rise and tilt back. At the critical moment, she quickly supported the ground with both hands, forming an arched motion. Fortunately, her back did not fall heavily on the sidewalk, and her hands were still holding on to the ground to avoid hitting her head. Wu Jianni took a breath and regained her senses. She saw a yellow object a little ahead of her feet. Her right hand looked forward and it turned out to be a banana peel, which almost caused her to fall to the ground. Wu Jianni thought in disgust, who is so unethical and littering banana peels? How unreasonable. Wu Jianni held a banana peel in her left hand and saw a nearby trash can. She threw the banana peel into the trash can. Wu Jianni continued to walk forward and arrived at the entrance of a certain coffee shop. Wu Jianni sat down in the empty seat and ordered 2 cups of jasmine coffee. After a while, a tall and burly man walked over. Wu Jianni exclaimed, "Xinxiang, I'm here." Zhu Xinxiang is Wu Jianni's boyfriend. 2 years ago, Zhu Xinxiang saved Wu Jianni after fighting a hooligan, so the two of them got to know each other and began to like each other. Zhu Xinxiang walked over with a slight smile and sat down in a chair, saying, "I'm sorry, I almost arrived late." Wu Jianni pursed her lips and looked at him, saying, "If you're late, you won't see me in your lifetime." Zhu Xinxiang smiled slightly and said, "So I said it was so close. I almost couldn't talk to you." Wu Jianni nodded and said, "I ordered 2 cups of jasmine coffee for you." Zhu Xinxiang exclaimed, "Shouldn't I invite you?" Wu Jianni waved her hand and said, "It's not that I ordered to pay, but rather that I asked you to pay after ordering, do you know?" Zhu Xinxiang touched his head and smiled slightly, saying, "I see. I thought you helped me buy coffee. If that's the case, I would feel embarrassed." Wu Jianni nodded and said, "Look at your virtue." She said, "By the way, my sister Law Qinghongjie is going to Tanko village for dinner this afternoon. Do you want to go with me?" "Of course there's no problem. By the way, I can also take care of you," said Zhu Xinxiang with a sigh. Wu Jianni let out a yelp and said, "Who said you should take care of me? With so many people around, do you still need to take care of me?" Zhu Xinxiang let out a sigh and said, "Oh my, in case you run into a robber on the road, I can still block your attack." Wu Jianni snorted and said, "Heroes save beauty. You have such thick skin." At this point, the coffee was delivered, with milk added and a pattern added. Zhu Xinxiang touched his head slightly and said, "I'm really sorry." Wu Jianni stirred the coffee with a spoon and then said, "We're like white-collar workers drinking coffee, listening to music, and feeling very comfortable." White-collar workers are a general term in society for employees in enterprises who do not require a lot of physical labor, also known as the white-collar class. They refer to individuals with higher educational backgrounds and work experience, corresponding to blue-collar workers who generally have stable income. They also refer to employees engaged in mental labor, such as managers, technicians, civil servants, etc., who often wear black suits when working. Zhu Xinxiang smiled slightly and said, "But it's like a farmer drinking barley tea with grass leaves, holding a boxed lunch, and eating with dirty hands, the opposite of a white-collar worker." Zhu Xinxiang and Wu Jianni were happily drinking coffee in the cafe. After drinking coffee, Zhu Xinxiang paid the bill. The two of them walked out of the coffee shop and strolled around the mall together. When they arrived at the beauty salon, 2 beautiful women were soliciting customers to experience beauty on both sides of the door. Seeing Zhu Xinxiang and Wu Jianni approaching the salon, they couldn't help but catch up and say, "Beauty, do you want to experience beauty?" they said to Wu Jianni. Wu Jianni waved her hand, indicating that she didn't want to go in. They continued to walk forward and arrived at the Yai gold shop, where they saw a dazzling array of gold, jade, and jewelry. Looking for the book garden www.zhaoshuyuan.com, sparkling gemstones shone brightly in the cabinet window. Zhu Xinxiang suggested that Wu Jianni might want to go in, but Wu Jianni shook her head and said she didn't want to go in, so she continued to move forward. Zhu Xinxiang said in confusion, "Why don't you go in and take a look?" Wu Jianni spread her hands and said, "I'm not interested in jewelry or anything." Wu Jianni felt it was strange that the little girl in front of her was not even interested in jewelry. They walked to the entrance of the shopping mall, opposite a building with a fixed large screen in the middle. The screen played advertisements and saw rows of trees with densely packed cables and countless small light bulbs on the cables. If all the small light bulbs on the trees lit up, it would illuminate the bustling road on Ma Road, which would be surprisingly bright. The two of them walked up the steps from the sidewalk to the passage above, where they saw a huge orange panel displayed in the shop window. Then they arrived at the square and saw a 2-meter-high fountain spewing out from the pool. As the fountain erupted, the fluorescent lights in the pool lit up, complementing each other. In the bustling crowd, a clown in a colorful costume was performing acrobatics. He was playing a spinning juggling ball with his left and right hands, and his coordination was very good, attracting more tourists. Wu Jianni said happily, "Thank you for accompanying me." Zhu Xinxiang was very excited and said, "You're welcome. I'm very happy to have coffee with you." They walked to the entrance of the mall and then hugged each other. I plan to say goodbye to each other. Wu Jianni felt very happy. It was the most interesting day of her evening, and she said, "Let's go on a date with me another day." Zhu Xinxiang was a bit reluctant to part ways, feeling that his date with her had ended too early, but forget it. Next time there was a chance, he said, "Okay. See you later." Chapter 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lawyer Ma Sheng is a novice lawyer and also a classmate of Zhu Xinli during her college years. He is a novice lawyer who has only handled a few civil disputes since his debut. However, despite his lack of experience, he achieved a winning rate of 100% with his clever mind, amazing eloquence, and calm attitude. Because of his almost perfect debut, he has won the title of excellent lawyer among his peers in just 6 months. Ma Sheng came to the park and planned to take a walk there. Ma Sheng saw Zhu Xinli walking over in the park and smiled, saying, "Long time no see. Xinli." Zhu Xinli looked at the visitor and exclaimed, "You are Ma Sheng." Ma Sheng chuckled and said, "Miss Xinli, do you still remember me?" Zhu Xinli snorted and said, "I've forgotten about it a long time ago." Ma Sheng exclaimed, "Didn't I always pursue you? Why are you so heartless?" "My dear." Zhu Xinli impatiently said, "Darling, did you call me?" Ma Sheng chuckled and said, "Of course, I can also call you my dear." "Get out of here," Zhu Xinli pouted and said, "Who allowed me to say that?" Ma Sheng chuckled and said, "I'm sorry, I went too far." Zhu Xinli said, "By the way, why are you here?" Ma Sheng smiled slightly and said, "Do you believe that I came to see you?" Zhu Xinli said sharply, "Forget it, I'm leaving. It's a waste of time talking to you." She turned around and wanted to leave. Ma Sheng chuckled and said, "Don't leave. It's not easy to meet. How can we not take a walk with you?" He said, "Do you think so?" Zhu Xinli turned around and snorted, "You're serious, but don't make a shameless move that would harass me halfway." Ma Sheng waved his hand and said, "I'm a lawyer. It's impossible for me to break the law with knowledge, you know." He said, "This kind of thing happens in the subway. Who knows how popular the subway is?" Zhu Xinli said, "If you have the ability, go take the subway and harass the little girl. Anyway, you have nothing to do." Ma Sheng chuckled and said, "I'm joking, let's go for a walk, shall we?" They walked from pebbles to an open platform, with a flat ground made of flesh-colored tiles. In front of them were 4 rows of mulberry trees, and the light green leaves on the trees formed a sunny yellow halo under the sunlight. Behind the mulberry trees was a deep blue lake surface, calm as water, and the undulating waves of the lake water could be seen. The reflection of the forest and lake water in the distance formed a feeling of reversing the two cities. In the distance, there was an island full of moss and shrubs on the lake surface, with a width area of only 20 meters. If you want to board that island, you must have a boat sailing there. There are several wooden beds moored on the opposite side in the distance, and there is a flesh-colored building on the shore of Hubo, which should be the charging point for renting a boat. Ma Sheng smiled and said, "This is the observation platform. It's peaceful and empty, and it's not as famous as People's Square." Zhu Xinli smiled and said, "If it weren't for you, the scenery would be even more pleasant." Ma Xing chuckled and said, "Don't say that." He said, "Do you remember the first time I kissed you here?" Zhu Xinlihe said, "Remember, I slapped you in the face. You feel very comfortable, right?" Ma Xing chuckled and said, "Almost so." Is that right? Chapter 10. You are listening at novelfull.audio. One after drinking Bloody Mary rose coffee, Wang Ying smiled and said, "It seems that the coffee is very good, but unfortunately it's not blood." Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "There's no way. If we use blood, it won't taste good. If it's animal blood to make coffee, we'll be treated like vampires to make bloody coffee." Wang Ying smiled and said, "That's not good either, but is it possible to launch such a good rare coffee?" Yu Qinghong nodded and said, "Thank you for opening this place." Wang Ying nodded and said, "I have something else to do. I'll go back to school first." Yu Qinghong said, "That's it. Let me help you go back to school." Yu Qinghong picked up the remote control and opened the rear landing door. She helped Wang Ying push onto the back playground. Wang Ying smiled and said, "That's it. I'll go alone." Yu Qinghong said, "Don't worry. This distance is a bit far. Don't underestimate me." Wang Ying smiled and said, "I have good strength and can push into school." Yu Qinghong smiled and said, "Then please pass safely." Yu Qinghong watched Wang Ying off, and after the principal pushed the wheelchair inside, he returned to the coffee shop and picked up the remote control to automatically close the landing door. Yu Qinghong yawned and then drank coffee, which tasted delicious. At this moment, Zhu Xian had just walked into the CAFA, and with a worried expression on his face, he said, "Give me a glass of bloody roses, I want to have a good drink." Yu Qinghong let out a sigh and said, "What's wrong, dear? You look unhappy." She said, "What's going on? What else can I say? I almost lost 3,000 yuan and even took a bag of gas." Zhu Xingang said, "It's unbearable." Yu Qinghong opened her mouth wide and said, "What did you say, almost lost 3,000 yuan? What's going on? Tell me more." Zhu Xingang hummed and said, "There was a white-collar worker from a company who was eating Hangzhou cabbage just now, and he actually had hair strands. I had intended to cook a new dish with good intentions, but he was not willing and forced me to compensate 3,000 yuan. No matter what I said, it was useless and almost reported this matter to the Industry and Commerce Bureau. So miserable." Yu Qinghong couldn't believe it and said, "So you gave him 3,000 yuan? "No," Zhu Xingang said with a groan, "I just looked at the surveillance and found out that this person actually wants to touch us." Touching porcelain. Yu Qinghong exclaimed in surprise, "How could such a thing happen?" She said, "What happened later?" Zhu Xingang nodded and said, "He knew we had surveillance footage and was too scared to speak, so he left." "It's really amazing." Yu Qinghong let out a sigh and said, "This kind of thing happened to us." She rubbed her head and said, "It's really unlucky. For some reason, I almost lost 3,000 yuan when I encountered it. It's like a vampire sucking all our money away." Zhu Xingang waved his hand and said, "It's not a big deal. If that's the case, we definitely have to call the police or something." Yu Qinghong nodded and said, "Yes, things like hitting porcelain are really cunning. If we were driving, we might encounter such things." "Let's see the devil with the porcelain," Zhu Xingang said with a smile, "I just need you." Yu Qinghong blushed and said, "You're really innocent." Zhu Xingang smiled and said, "It's better to go through this kind of thing. If I repeat the same mistake, I can't bear it anymore."